Brazil, like the United States, has gotten caught up in the trap of mass incarceration over the last several decades. In fact, it has recently earned the dubious status of having the world's third largest number of people behind bars, reaching some 750,000 in 2018, which is up from 150,000 in 2000. That's a five-fold increase in less than 2 decades. Now, these numbers are still much lower than the US total of 2.1 million people incarcerated. And Brazil's rate of imprisoning people is still less than half of that of the United States. But in many ways, the consequences of this mass incarceration in Brazil have been far more extreme. To begin with, prisons here in Brazil are wildly overcrowded, running on average at 165% of capacity, and some facilities reaching as much as 1,000% of capacity. Take a look at this prison I visited last week in the state of Pernambuco, for example. It's called O Presídio Rodenildo da Rocha Leão. When it was built back in the early 1980s, it was intended to house just 74 inmates. Today, more than 800 human souls are packed inside, just like little sardines, all in one big cage-like structure. As much as I hate being the victim of crime, it's painful to look into the face of these human beings in such conditions. Anyway, after years of complaints from prison authorities, the federal government last year finally provided funding to build an extension on the Rodenildo complex, which is due to be inaugurated in early 2021. It looks like this, all big and fancy and new. But according to my friend Wellington, the warden, this won't stop the overcrowding. First, because the capacity of the new extension is set at only 300 inmates, and they still have 800. But secondly, because once it is inaugurated, other overpopulated prisons all over Brazil are going to immediately start transferring their own overload of prisoners to this new facility. Wellington says that this is very bad news, and here's why. Mass incarceration in Brazil has become the primary mechanism of recruitment for the country's most powerful organized crime syndicates. This is important because the growth of these crime syndicates, which here in Brazil are called facções, is a huge driver of corruption and violence in the country. And Brazil, in absolute terms, is today the most violent national society in the whole world. On average, somewhere between 50 and 60,000 people are murdered here every single year, representing about 13% of the total number of homicides worldwide. Now, if you add that all up, close to 1.5 million Brazilians have been murdered just since 1990. And to put this number in perspective, that's more than all of the UN-recognized genocides in the same period of time put together. But what do these horrendous numbers have to do with prisons? Well, mass incarceration and overcrowded prisons create conditions that are highly favorable for the formation of prison gangs. And once formed, prisons then become, in effect, giant recruitment centers for these gangs, while also serving as a sort of physical headquarters from which they can manage and control illicit markets out in the streets. How does all of this work? First, prison overcrowding makes it difficult or even impossible for prison authorities to effectively control their inmate population. It is simply too dangerous and, more importantly, too expensive to do so. As a result, they tend to abrogate de facto authority within the prison to the prisoners themselves. And well, like in The Lord of the Flies, the most aggressive inmates tend to organize themselves and take charge, often in a brutish kind of way. And in the process, they become what we call gangs. In a sense then, prison authorities foster the formation of prison gangs because gangs are the best suited organizational units to impose order on an inmate population. The problem is that once a prison gang establishes control on the inside, mass incarceration then provides a constant flow of captive recruits, people who may not have any prior gang experience before going to prison, but will have little choice but to integrate themselves into the gang's hierarchy simply in order to secure decent food and clothing, a sufficient living space, and even their own safety once inside prison walls. And the shaping of an inmate's destiny in this way can be patently absurd. Prison authorities in the state of Bahia told me a few years ago, for example, that each time they receive a new prisoner, they have to ask him which facção he belongs to. And get this, if he doesn't belong to any, well, then he's asked to pick whichever one he prefers so that they can select which container cell to put him in. The one controlled by this gang or the one controlled by that gang. And neutrality is really not an option in most cases. From inside prison walls, organized prison gangs then can effectively control and direct criminal activity out in the streets. How do they do this? Well, mostly by cell phone apps like WhatsApp these days. How do they get phones inside the prisons, though, you might ask? Well, they usually come inside the nether cavities of so-called nuptial visitors, but they are also smuggled into prison through prison guards or through food providers or visiting religious leaders even, and in some cases they're actually flown in by slingshot or even by drone. And, well, why don't the authorities block the cell phone signals then? Well, that's a funny thing. No one seems to know. My friend Wellington, the warden, told me the other day that he actually ordered his signal blocking technology from Israel more than 5 years ago. The problem is it just never showed up. Well, what happened to it? He suspects that somebody paid some big money to keep it stuck at customs indefinitely. Okay, so the prison gangs have cell phones, you say, but how do they get people to follow their orders out in the streets? The issue here is that the typical inmate, when he is released, tends to already be indebted to his prison gang, and he will then be expected to pay taxes once he is back out on the streets. Now, these taxes come in the form of both monthly fees and occasional favors, such that he might have to send $100 or so back to the prison each month while making a gun run or executing an enemy whenever such services are needed. And if he doesn't comply, well, you guessed it, then he becomes another homicide statistic, of course. But even if he avoids that fate, it is likely he'll end up in prison again someday anyways, at which point he'll have to confront his masters once and for all. In the end, whether they like it or not, most inmates inducted into the world of organized crime through the prisons have great difficulty leaving until they're dead or incapacitated in some way. Now, 40 years ago, this dynamic of prison-based criminal recruitment and illicit market control was limited to just a few large Babylonian-like cities in Brazil. But in the late 1990s, something started to change. The introduction of crack cocaine to consumer markets all across Brazil provoked a massive crime wave, and in its wake, a sharp increase in the number of people being incarcerated. At the time, state governments in places like São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro began transferring some of their most dangerous inmates to other states, and they were hoping to disarticulate the prison gangs themselves that had been causing them so many problems. But as you can imagine, this simply had the effect of spreading the organizational template of the prison gang to other states across the country, while also expanding access to vast criminal networks that stretched not just from Brazil, but all the way around South America. Now, by 2010, more or less, most Brazilian prisons nationwide were being governed, at least on the inside, by these highly organized prison gangs, replete with ideologically worded mission statements, codified behavioral regulations, bylaws, and really cool names like the Comando Vermelho, Comando da Paz, os Carecas do ABC, e o Bonde do Maluco. And they began controlling crime in the streets too, which in most Brazilian cities meant exercising a pervasive form of territorial governance in sprawling slum communities known as favelas, where the local populations would serve as both cash cows and human shields for their criminal enterprise. Naturally, these prison gangs then went to war with each other, driving up homicide rates across the country as they did so. And these wars have increased in both frequency and intensity over the years, becoming ever more dramatic and high profile as time passes. This is mostly thanks to the introduction of heavier, more modern weaponry that has been made available by the internationally expanding criminal markets. To illustrate, my very first night in Rio de Janeiro some 12 years ago, I was startled by the racket of machine gun fire. So, being the great genius that I am, I stuck my head out of the window, and when I did, I saw it up in the sky, a beautiful as Christmas lights, bright red tracer bullets whizzing over my head. In the last few years, however, another major change in the structure and the scope of prison-based organized crime has been underway. On January 1st, 2017, the São Paulo-based Primeiro Comando da Capital, or PCC, which was already the country's largest and most powerful prison gang at this point, declared an all-out war against the second most powerful gang, the Comando Vermelho from Rio de Janeiro, and all of its allies nationwide, including the notorious Família do Norte, the northern family crime group up in the Amazon region. Now, the PCC had been preparing for this war for several years, having secretly launched a recruitment campaign to draw in new members in all of Brazil's 26 federated states, boosting its card-carrying membership during this time to about 30,000. As you can imagine, the war was vicious. In just 2 weeks, prison rebellions left more than 135 people dead, a great many of whom were decapitated or otherwise mutilated. And videos of these cruel deeds were live streamed on Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp all across the country. Then, violence bled into the streets as rival gangs, following dictates texted to them from prison, went to war with each other, block by block, in dozens of cities across the country. Some gangs, accusing the government of siding with one prison gang over the other, engaged in what political scientist Benjamin Lessing calls violent lobbying. In order to pressure the state to offer greater protection against prison massacres and other such things, they ordered their street-level members out to machine gun police stations, throw hand grenades there, burn city buses, and cause all sorts of chaos. To this day, Brazil's great gang war of 2017 remains unresolved. No one has won, but a lot of people have lost everything. That year, 64,000 Brazilians lost their lives to criminal violence. Meanwhile, the prison gang complex in Brazil has grown ever larger and ever more complex, concentrating wealth and power to such an extent that, like a towering mountain range, it sort of generates its own political economic weather system, pulling a widening array of typically legitimate political actors and institutions into the orbit of corruption and violence that they manage. As a consequence of this sort of hypermagnetic pull, the relationship between organized crime and the state no longer really looks so much like an epic struggle between some good actor and some evil actor, but rather like a political criminal symbiosis between two codependent sets of armed actors, one with badges and the other with tattoos. Now, if this discussion has made you feel hopeless and wanting to lash out, you're not alone. Fed up with this increasing violence, the pervasive fear of being robbed, and the clear-as-day corruption of state officials, millions of Brazilians have become sort of exasperated with the situation, as you can imagine. And in their desperation, they have voted again and again for politicians who promise to come down hard on crime and to lock those criminals up and throw away the key forever and ever. It was in no small part for this reason that Jair Bolsonaro won the 2018 presidential elections here. But this is precisely where we run head-on into the very crux of the matter. Mass incarceration and overpopulated prisons is where so much of this problem got started in the very first place. What do we expect will happen if, in response to this ever-increasing tide of crime, we simply put more and more people behind bars? I know there are no easy solutions to the problems of crime and violence here in Brazil or elsewhere in Latin America. But one thing is apparent. Prisons, as they are currently managed today, tend to give us more of an illusion of order than order itself. But what do you think? I'm Professor Mike Wolf, and this is Latin American Politics Online.
Soy el fuego que arde tu piel. Soy el agua que mata tu sed, el castillo, la torre, yo soy la espada que guarda el caudal, tú el aire que respiro yo y la luz de la luna en el mar, la garganta que ansio mojar.
Deixa eu te falar, vou te confessar. Acho que eu também sou poeta e não aprendi a amar. Não, cruzes que eu já carreguei, cada um com a sua lei. Ontem mesmo eu perguntei por que eu nunca parei, hein? Quer saber o que me move? Quer saber o que me prende? São correntes sanguíneas, não